Hi everybody, this is Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com. Today I'm going to be going over a hand I played in a 100 NL game, and after I've finished giving my thoughts on it I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Little and he's going to tell us all what he thinks about the play of both myself and the villains in the piece. So to start off, here you can see I'm playing as the hero in the cutoff. It's folded round to me and I open for 2.25x. The effective stack as far as I'm concerned is 90 BB deep. Next villain folds, the villain on the button calls, the small blind folds and the big blind also calls. So we take the flop with $7.25 in the pot and it comes 6, 10, 8 and obviously a very wet flop with the 10 and 8 of diamonds. The villain the big blind checks and I now decide not to c-bet in this pot. I don't like c-betting here even though I have top pair, top kicker and the backdoor flush, as facing a raise is going to make it very awkward for me. I'd rather just check here and keep both villains' ranges quite wide. Obviously I'm not likely to improve on the turn, so I check and the button checks behind, and then the turn brings the king of hearts, which obviously puts 2 hearts on board as well as 2 diamonds. The button now checks again, and at this point I decide that I'm going to bet, and I bet out an amount that I think is about 70% of the pot. I think my check on the flop is fine, and I also think this bet is fine, and it's slightly bizarre because on the flop I had top pair, top kicker and didn't want to bet, and here I only have second pair, top kicker, but here I think it's a better situation to bet because I think it's much more important to protect my hand now with only one card to come. The villain on the button calls this bet and the big blind folds. Now the river card comes and that pairs the 6, which is obviously quite a good card for me because if I was ahead on the turn I'm very likely to be ahead on the river. I don't think I could get any value at all here by betting. I think it's much better to play a check call strategy to try and pick off a bluff from a busted draw that the button could easily have. So I check, and when the button bets around, I think that's about 55-60% pot, I think I have a fairly easy call. And in fact I take down the pot because the villain shows up with Queen Jack of Hearts for a very strong draw on the turn with the flush draw in hearts and also an open ender from the 10 to the king. Now when I saw here what the villain's hand was and I'd won the pot, my initial impression was that the villain had misplayed the hand, because if I was the villain with his very strong draw on the turn I would almost certainly here, remember he's got the Queen Jack of Hearts, after I bet I think I would raise here. I'd make something like a pot-sized raise, and then obviously it's pretty hard for me to call. In fact I'm not going to call with the ace 10, I'm going to fold there to a pot-sized raise, and he has so many outs with the flush draw and the open ender that it's never really that bad an idea to put pressure on the kind of drawing hand that I may have. Even if I have a hand like ace king here and I bet and he raises me, it's going to be very hard for me to call on the river even if it blanks off and he makes a pot-sized bet on the river. So I would have preferred him to raise here on the turn rather than making the bluff on the river, which was relatively easy to pick off. So I decided to consult Poker Snowy and see what Poker Snowy had to say about this hand. So I now keyed this hand into Poker Snowy, and Poker Snowy offers assessments for each of the moves played during the hand, and we can see what it thinks of both my play and the villain with the Queen Jack of Hearts. So with me starting off with the raise, the assessments are given down here. You can see in what it thinks about calling and raising, and the overall verdict is given here. So Snowy fairly obviously thinks that my open from the cutoff with ace 10 off, sorry, not the cutoff, the hijack with ace 10 off is correct. And when it gets to the player with the Queen Jack of Hearts, again we can see down here Snowy is perfectly happy with this calling play. And then we don't know what player 3 has, but he calls, and then the flop comes down 6, 10, 8. And as I mentioned before, I liked my check here, and Poker Snowy is in agreement and has although it does err towards betting with a kind of mixed strategy. When these two EVs are very similar, or indeed the same as they are here, that means that Poker Snowy wants to play a kind of mixed strategy. But it's basically happy with the check, and also happy with doesn't like player one checking behind, and prefers a bet there, but only very marginally. I mean, the difference of 0.12 is fairly marginal. Anyway, the interesting play comes on the turn when the King of Hearts comes up. Player 3 checks. I now bet, and Snowy is again happy with this, again liking a mixed strategy but not having a problem with my bet. But what surprises me here about this whole hand is that Snowy likes the call and doesn't like the raise, which I find very surprising. You can see the difference between the EVs of 2.65 and minus 0.35 is 3, which is this is in big bet, so this is like a 3 big bet error to raise here. Whereas to my eye, the raise here looks very strong. I mean, I'm not marked out with a particularly strong hand myself. And so I think here the raise from player 1 on the button, with the likely intention of potting it on a lot of rivers, would be a very good way to play the hand. But Snowy kind of violently disagrees and thinks that would be a fairly serious mistake. Player 3 folds, and we can now see what Snowy thinks of the river play. Fairly obviously Snowy is happy with me checking here, but that seems very obvious to me. It thinks that betting would be a very big mistake. And now when player 1 makes his bluff on the river, Snowy is happy with this. And I think this is, to my eye, this is quite a weak play, because it's fairly easy for me to pick off with any kind of made hand. Since the board is so wet, there are, very obviously a substantial number of drawing hands that Snowy has here. So I'm curious to see what Jonathan will make of this hand, because I don't instinctively agree with how Snowy wants to play the hand, and I'll be interested to hear Jonathan's opinions. This has been Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com.
Hello, this is Jonathan Little, and I'm perfectly fine with the pre-flop raise, of course. And then on the flop, you decided to check multi-way. And I think if this pot was heads up, you can be a little bit more inclined to check. But multi-way, it's so easy for either opponent to have plenty of equity, especially since the player in the big blind called with presumably a somewhat wide range that should connect well enough with this board where he has some sort of a pair or a gut shot. So your hand's obviously good enough to check call, but I think you can easily bet. If you get raised by either of the players, it's a pretty rough spot where I don't really think you can fold, especially given you have the backdoor nut flush draw. But I don't think that's going to happen a ton, and I think there's a lot more merit or concern with protecting your hand and also getting called by various hands like ace-8 and ace-6 and pocket 7s and pocket 9s. And there's a lot of hands that can very easily call you that you have in pretty bad shape. So I would typically bet on this in this spot, and we see that Poker Snowy suggests betting as well in general. Now, it's suggesting mixing it up. Usually, I try to do what it just says to do. Most of the time, it's really hard to balance in these spots. And, balance is a tough thing. So anyway, I would have certainly bet the flop. And if you bet the flop, this player's probably going to call or raise. Either way, that's fine. So now you get to the turn, and you decide to bet. And I think this is fine as well, given you check the flop. Like you said, at this point, there is merit in protection. I also don't hate checking here, as we see Snowy doesn't actually mind checking either. And the reason it doesn't mind checking is because if you check and your opponent bets, you can very easily check call the turn and quite often check call the river. I would be interested to see what it thinks the player on the button or the player in the big blind are going to do if they have a king on the turn, because Poker Snowy assumes that the opponents play well, right? So it does assume the opponent's always going to bet stuff like king, queen, king, jack, king 9, etc. on the flop? Or is it going to assume that it checks those hands a lot of the time? And if it checks those hands a lot of the time, then clearly the king is okay for that range. Whereas if it bets those hands all the time, then the king is not so good. But I think in general, a lot of people in actual games do check behind on the flop with stuff like king, queen, and just try to get there. So that's probably the reason why it says that checking is certainly acceptable. But I don't mind the bet as you do. I would probably check the turn in general, but betting's fine. So you do bet. And now this is a spot where you were surprised by Poker Snowy's recommendation to just call. And it probably assumes that the hero here is primarily betting with kings and other strong made hands, like maybe some weird slow play, and then just garbage like ace queen. And if you have that range, also draws, of course, but the queen jack of hearts blocks a lot of draws. If you have that range, there's no point in raising against the nut hands and the kings, because those hands are just never ever folding. And then against hands like ace queen, I don't know if you're necessarily always going to win that on the river, because the ace queen is going to check the river, presuming that you could very easily have a king. But you're going to be able to pick up that pot a lot of the time. And if your opponent is betting a hand like this ace 10 here, you're not going to be able to win it too often, but even then you have plenty of equity. So the only time raising is really great, in my mind, with this hand is when you think, or is when your opponent has a marginal made hand. But a lot of those marginal made hands just bet the flop. I mean, like I just told you, I would have bet the flop with the ace 10. So if I think my opponent's betting the flop with ace 10, then what's he really betting on the turn? He's betting either draws, which we happen to block most of, and kings. And if your opponent has a king or a nut hand that he slow played, which you really shouldn't be slow playing too much on this flop, but if your opponent does have a king, he's just not going to fold. So why raise if your opponent's not going to fold? Plus, you have a hand that if you do raise and your opponent happens to shove on you or re-raise, if you make it $5, maybe he'd make it 15. You could then make it 40. I mean, that puts your opponent in an unhappy situation. Of course, he's not folding, but at this point, he's behind a lot of the time, right? Well, he is behind because he has queen high. And whenever you're behind, very often, if you're getting a reasonable price to call in position, that's going to be the right play. And as we see, that is what Snowy suggests doing. Let's see if you actually ran it on the river. So you check, and Snowy does suggest betting in his shoes, which I think is obvious and good. It's a little bit unfortunate because he does block the flush draws, which are hands that would very often check fold the river. So now it's more likely that Hero has ace, queen, ace, jack, and then kings that he decided to check, and also tens that he decided to play in this manner. So it's kind of a rough spot to bluff, and you probably don't need to be bluffing too often. But in reality, player one here really doesn't have that many busted draws, I don't think. I think he's going to have mostly stuff like eights and kings and tens. And I think you do want to value bet a king on the river. So if you're going to be value betting your kings, you certainly want to be betting with some bluffs. So pretty cool hand. I think the opponent's turn play depends a lot on what he thinks you're going to be doing on the flop. As you have more hands like tens and eights and sixes in your range by checking the flop and then betting the turn, that should make the queen jack of hearts more inclined to raise. But as your range gets stronger on the turn, because presumably you'd bet tens and some eights on the flop, that's going to make calling way better. So that's this hand. It's a pretty fun one. I'm excited to see more of these. Thank you for watching here at dmbpoker.com.